Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Devona Mallory. I'm chair of the ASU Gender Studies Committee here on campus. And welcome to our 10th annual ASU Women's Studies Symposium. I am so excited. This year, our theme is hashtag Truth to Power. Truth to power was a term coined in the 1940s by people standing up to fascism and tyranny. And this year, many people, men and women and children, are standing up to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. It is our time to take a stand and speak our truth. And I'm hoping that the presentations we have today will be enlightening and thought-provoking, and now it is time for us to make changes to make this world a better place. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Pat Bonner, a colleague of mine in the English department, and so here we are.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to talk about a lesser-known poet of the Harlem Renaissance, Esther Poeple Shaw. And the title of my presentation is Stop Lynching While Pledging Allegiance to the Flag and Calling Yourselves Christians. When you think of the Harlem Renaissance, I'm pretty sure that Esther Poeple Shaw is not a name you've heard alongside others like Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes or Countee Cullen, but she is a poet of the Harlem Renaissance, and her activism echoes all the way up to the 21st century. Although she is known for her lyrical and romantic poetry, this female voice boldly protested against lynching and racial terrorism that covered America during the early 20th century. This morning, I want to talk about two of her poems, one entitled Flag Salute and the other one, Blasphemy, America's Style. They provide a scorching rebuke of two of America's sacred traditions, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Christian religion, against the backdrop of lynching. This very militant, angry female voice of the Harlem Renaissance remains extremely relevant today. Just a little background information on Esther Poeple. She was born in 1896 to Joseph Gibb and Helen Anderson Poeple in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She graduated from high school, went on to Dickinson College. She was the first African American to graduate from Dickinson College in 1919. Her major was Latin and modern languages. Very smart. She won a top scholarship and was inducted as a member of Phi Beta Kappa. And after 6 years after graduating from college, she met a chemist named William Andrew Shaw, and they had one daughter, and she married him, and they had one daughter. Poeple was friends with some of the major players of the Harlem Renaissance, like Langston Hughes, Marita Bonner, and Georgia Douglas Johnson. But while many other writers of the Harlem Renaissance chose not to protest against inequality or Jim Crow or racial violence in their writings, Esther Poeple did. And you can add her name to the list of people who protested during the Harlem Renaissance, like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. She also published her poetry in the Black social, literary, and uplift magazines like The Crisis, which was the NAACP's magazine, and the National Urban League's magazine, Opportunity. So she published a lot in these social magazines. She was also connected with Dr. Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and she was a proponent of women's rights and improving education for minorities. So she really was a vanguard during her time. The first poem I'm going to read by Poeple is entitled Flag Salute. It was published in the Crisis magazine in 1933. And the description of this poem, the description of the lynching in this poem is very frank, especially for a woman who wrote during the 1930s. So I'm going to read the poem. It's entitled Flag Salute. It's interesting that she interweaves lines from the pledge with this poem. So I hope you'll recognize the lines from the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. They dragged him naked through the muddy streets, a feeble-minded black boy, and the charge, supposed assault upon an aged woman. Of the United States of America. 1 mile they dragged him like a sack of meal, a rope around his neck, a bloody ear left dangling by the patriotic hand of Nordic youth, a boy of 17, and to the republic for which it stands. And then they hanged his body to a tree below the window of the county judge, whose pleadings for that battered human flesh were stifled by the brutish, raucous howls of men and boys and women with their babes, brought out to see the bloody spectacle of murder in the style of 33. 3,000 strong they were, one nation indivisible. To make the tale complete, they built a fire. What matters that the stuff they burned was flesh and bone and hair, and reeking gasoline. With liberty and justice, they cut the rope in bits and passed them out for souvenirs among the men and boys. The teeth, no doubt, on golden chains will hang about the favored necks of sweethearts, wives, and daughters, mothers, sisters, babies too, for all. Poeple wrote this poem in response to a highly publicized lynching of a black man that occurred in 1933. This man was named George Armwood. A 71-year-old woman named Mary Denson said that she was walking down a road in Princess Anne when a young black man jumped out and attempted to assault her. She identified this young black man, this 71-year-old woman, as George Armwood, and the police immediately organized a search party to find him. They found him. They drug him into a field and beat him almost to death. A mob of over 1,000 people stormed the jail. They took him, and before he was hung from a tree some distance away, Armwood was dragged through the streets, beaten, stabbed, and had one ear hacked off. They hung him, and then his lifeless body was paraded through the town and ended up near the town's courthouse, where the mob doused the corpse with gasoline and set it on fire. So what Poeple did was to take this actual lynching and put the details of it in her poem, Flag Salute. And she told this story against the backdrop of the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. So she provides all of these details about him being dragged, about the fact that it's a young boy who was accused by an elderly woman, and they hung him, and after they hung him, they burned him. And this lynching is described as if it is a celebration. It's a time for people to get together, enjoy each other, and celebrate. Also, they took souvenirs from his body. They took pieces of his finger. They took some of his teeth. They cut the ropes that hung him and gave out part of the rope for souvenirs. So what Poeple did was to take this actual event and put it into her poetry. And that was very, very forward for a female in the 1930s. The Pledge of Allegiance has its political roots in white nationalism. The author of the pledge Francis Bellamy, who was a pastor of a Baptist church. His goal was to define true Americanism against the rising tide of immigrants pouring into the country in the early 20th century. These were people from races that he thought would lower America's racial standard. Bellamy said, and I quote, "We cannot be the dumping ground of Europe and bloom like a flower garden." So, like countless others during this time, he feared that the poor stock of immigrants would come in and threaten the American culture. So he created the pledge as a way to consolidate white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American values that the mainstream perceived was under siege. So the nationalism that gave birth to the Pledge of Allegiance is still with us today at a time when the President of the United States demands restrictive immigration laws in the wake of terrorist attacks, and he promises to build a great wall between the United States and Mexico to curb the flow of Mexican migrants whom he has branded as criminals and rapists. People today rebel against reciting the pledge or standing for the national anthem because the flag continues to fly over an America filled with racism, hate, and violence towards minorities. So Pople's poem, Flag Salute, speaks truth to power by juxtaposing a lynching with the words of the sacred Pledge of Allegiance. This second poem, the voice is even stronger, and the title of it is Blasphemy, American Style. And it's quite shocking because Pople herself was a religious lady who did write some poems in the vein of Christianity, but this poem entitled Blasphemy, American Style is really, really strong, powerful, and filled with the language that people would use during this time period. And I'll read it now. Blasphemy, American Style. Look, God, we've got a nigger here to burn, a goddamn nigger, and we're going to plunge his cringing soul to hell. Now watch him squirm and wriggle while we swing him from this tree. And listen, God, you'll laugh at this, I know. He wants to pray before we stage this show. He's scared and can't remember what to say. Imagine God, a nigger, trying to pray. Lean over, God, and listen while we tell this fool the words he couldn't even spell. Our Father, who art in heaven. Say it again. Thy will be done on earth. Laugh, God. Amen. To hell with him. Come on, men. Swing him high. A praying nigger. Golly, watch him die. So, again, this poem opens with the voice of a white person who's telling God about the way he's going to lynch a nigger. And she uses the authentic voice and the words from this time period of people who would have called African Americans niggers. So her choice of language transports us back to the early 20th century, Jim Crow, separatism, white superiority. To show the intensity of this white person's hatred, we hear him say that this black man is a GD nigger. And this profanity, coupled with a racial epithet, must have been shocking during Esther Pople's time. Also, in this poem, the person who's going to lynch this black man keeps talking to God, telling God to watch this black man squirm and wriggle as they swing him from a tree. And in the next stanza, he believes that God will laugh at the fact that the man who's going to be lynched wants to pray. He tells God that this man is so scared of being lynched that he can't even remember how to pray. And all of this is funny. He says to God, imagine a nigger trying to pray. This indicates that many whites thought that God would be pleased for them to take justice into their own hands in the most violent way. And how dare a black man pray to God for help when this is what he deserves for his supposed crimes against whites? He then calls the lynching victim a fool. They began to scream the words of the Lord prayer to the man. And in effect, the speaker is saying that God's will on earth is to lynch black people. The joy and hatred in this man's voice, who's about to lynch this black man, it echoes through time to the voices of racial hatred that we hear today. Because still today, black people are praying to God, and still today there's a need for them to pray. The fact that Poeple is a religious woman and she turns Christianity on its hypocritical underbelly by having a white racist mock God and mock black people's devotion to him, it shows her willingness to expose the ugly truth about America and race. It shows her pure disdain for how whites twisted Christianity to support the worst in human nature, like slavery and lynching. Poeple's poem was so timely. From 1882 to 1968, there were 4,743 lynchings, and of that, 3,446 were black. Any crime, supposed crime, could cause someone to be lynched. Gambling, quarreling, arguing with a white man, attempting to vote, unruly remarks, demanding respect, acting suspiciously, and the number one crime was the supposed rape of a white woman. But if you looked at a white woman, if you misspoke to a white woman, that was translated to the rape of the white woman. But African Americans and other groups began to fight against lynching. People like Ida B. Wells Barnett and the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. And they were not just outraged at the act of lynching, but the fact that it was a community event that included children, babies, adults, ordinary citizens. And so they attacked lynching on every front. Poeple took a very public stand against lynching with these two poems. The Board of Education in Washington, D.C. found her poem Flag Salute objectionable and offensive. So they recommended that the Crisis magazine be removed from the schools. So she did suffer some penalties for using her voice. But more than just protesting, Poeple pushed forward the dialogue of self-construction for a people who had been stripped of a healthy identity that was masked by stereotypes and deeply ingrained racism. So she stomped on injustices that murdered her people, and she left a realistic literary record in history of her strong protest against lynching, racism, and racist Christianity in America. Her voice and her poetry still resonate with us today. Thank you.
Please give Dr. Bonner. This is based on a book about this woman here, Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, a woman out of Georgia, from Augusta, Georgia. And I wanted, first off, feminism started with liberal feminism. Mary Wollstonecraft, back in the 1790s, wrote two works, Vindication of the Rights of Men and Vindication of the Rights of Women. Mary Wollstonecraft died in childbirth because at that time it was a common practice for doctors not to wash their hands. And she gave birth to a woman who eventually became Mary Shelley, the woman who wrote the novel Frankenstein. Now, it kind of lumbered along for a little while after that, but the first wave gathered steam in the 1800s. Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, for example, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, my hero Harriet Tubman, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So the first wave lasted from the 1790s to the 1960s. And the whole goal of this movement was to give women the right to vote. In my home state of Illinois, women got to vote on a state level starting in 1912. And it did not have, women's right to vote on a federal level did not happen until 1920, just to let you know. And this movement also intersected with abolitionism, trying to free the slaves. Sojourner Truth was big in that movement, and of course, Harriet Tubman. And Ella Gertrude was in the thick of that as well. Part of this time period overlaps with the idea of the cult of true womanhood. And this lasted, from 1820 right through the Victorian era. If you notice, you've got the family, the woman's got the kids right there, dad's reading, but she is the center of the home, the center of the domestic sphere. That was what women's place was in the home. And this was a massive propaganda movement, especially with regards to the middle and upper class women in the U.S. and England. And the whole idea was to keep women submissive, okay? They were supposed to be pious, religious, pure, domesticated, and the women were the center of the household. The man went to work, came home, and didn't have to do anything. And the women don't need to be educated because they're not going to work. And that was the mentality. The husband was going to bring in the money. There was a big work in 1854 by the poet Coventry Patmore. It was a poem called The Angel in the House. And that also perpetuated women staying in the household, okay? And this is kind of like an updated version of courtly love from the times of chivalry. The woman in the house is put up on the pedestal. She's pure. She holds everything down. She is worshipped from afar. And that's where the tail end of the Victorian era came through under this. And the women's suffrage movement and their right to vote, this is one of the biggest things they were combating. Now, at this time, you have women trying to get the right to vote around the world. In the U.S., it started with the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention in 1848. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which basically freed the slaves. Well, it didn't technically free the slaves. They were already freed, but it was this idea of giving suffrage regardless of race, but it didn't include women. So if you were a black woman, and that is still today, any woman, you were technically free because of your race, but not free because you're a woman. You didn't have that same amount of freedom. And then in the 1910s, like I pointed out with Illinois, individual states started voting. Men used to vote in bars because no self-respecting woman went to a saloon. And even now, if you're at the bar, at the club, some men think you're there to get, what? Because those, and up until the 1970s, late 1970s, most bars didn't even have women's bathrooms. Okay? Just to let you know. So being in a bar, a guy could go and vote, have a drink, And I do want to let you know, in the state of Georgia, even though the federal government made it possible for women to vote in 1920, the state of Georgia, in the state of Georgia, women weren't allowed to vote until 1921. Okay, just to let you know. Now, after women gained the right to vote, they fought for legalizing alcohol, which led to prohibition, which some of you may have heard of. From 1920 to 1933, alcohol was outlawed in this country. And that was one of the good things and the bad things of this movement. Women got the right to vote, but then they also made it where, hey, we are going to get rid of people drinking alcohol, which, on some levels may be a good thing. Unfortunately, because of prohibition, that allowed the mob to get a stranglehold in this country, the mafia. Now, I do have to say, if it wasn't about alcohol, the mafia would have found another angle to get in. So we just can't blame it all on women voting for the first time, okay? So there's always a positive and negative. Now with Gertrude, now these movements in Georgia about the women's suffrage and the banning of alcohol, guess what? Started in church, okay? Gertrude gave speeches, she wrote poetry and essays, and she also published works in newspapers. She came from money. Her father was kind of rare because he gave her an education and even, tried to leave her his money, which was unheard of. But unfortunately, because of, I guess through her husband's bad investments and dealings, she was broke most of her adult life. Okay. And also, her husband was an alcoholic. And she's seeing, and other women are seeing their men drinking and spending all their money on booze and whatever not. They are like, oh, no, we need to stop alcohol usage. And so she, because of her husband, this personal link, she joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was another big organization at this time. Temperance, of course, no alcohol. And the WCTU would not endorse women's suffrage. So she joined the Georgia Suffrage Association and the Atlanta Equal Suffrage Association. She also became part of the National American Women's Suffrage. So she also fought for prison reform and the education of women. Now I'm going to, and because this is Georgia, definitely I'm going to show you some clips, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with Scarlett O'Hara, Gone with the Wind. And this is a very short but pivotal scene.
I'll never be hungry again. No, nor any of my folk. If I have to lie, steal, cheat, or kill, as God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again.
as Scarlett O'Hara, it demonstrated the strength and the fortitude of not only women from Georgia, but Southern women and women in general. A woman who is not going to be defeated, who is going to stand up for herself and learn how to survive in really terrible conditions. And that was part of what Gertrude was going through in her life. She had a troubled marriage. She had no money, but she was working to make this world a better place for women. And that's some part of the indomitable spirit of when you hear about Georgian women. And I don't know if you know this, but Vivian Leigh was British. And she won a Best Actress Oscar for this role. In fact, she won another Best Actress Oscar for playing another Southern belle in A Streetcar Named Desire. So you have a British woman winning 2 Oscars for playing Southern women. Now the other slide here is, is the sitcom Designing Women. How many of you know Designing Women? You should. This is a show ran from 1986 to 1993, one of my all-time favorite shows. It's set in Atlanta, Georgia. It's about 4 women designers, and they all fit the archetype of womanhood, of Southern womanhood. Now we are going from Scarlett O'Hara, and back in the day, to who was the epitome of the Southern belle, to the new women of the New South after slavery, after Reconstruction, women who are allowed to vote, women who have some kind of autonomy. Now, this lady over here is, the first lady is Mary Jo, the single, recently divorced mom who's a Spitfire. The next, the tall blonde, is Charlene, the innocent ingenue that came from a really huge, poor but happy family. And then you have the Sugar Baker sisters. Julia's the third. She is the classy, liberal crusader. And her sister, Suzanne, the ex-beauty queen who's living off the alimony from various ex-husbands. And I'm going to show you a couple pivotal scenes because this show, if anything, yes, it had a lot of things about Georgia, which of course is very important. But this show was also relatable, especially to me growing up. One of my biggest influences was this show and learning how to stand up for myself. And this is a scene with Julia defending her sister Suzanne the night the lights went out in Georgia.
Excuse me. Aren't you Marjorie Lee Winnick, the current Miss Georgia World?
Why, yes, I am.
I'm Julia Sugarbaker, Suzanne Sugarbaker's sister. I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here.
Yes, and I gather from your comments there are a couple of other things you don't know, Marjorie. For example, you probably didn't know that Suzanne was the only contestant in Georgia pageant history to sweep every category except congeniality. And that is not something the women in my family aspire to anyway.
That's really
Or that when she walked down the runway in her swimsuit, 5 contestants quit on the spot. Or that when she emerged from the isolation booth to answer the question, what would you do to prevent war? She spoke so eloquently of patriotism, battlefields, and diamond tiaras. Grown men wept.
That's really...
And you probably didn't know, Marjorie, that Suzanne was not just any Miss Georgia. She was the Miss Georgia. She didn't twirl just a baton. That baton was on fire.
Look, that's...
And when she threw that baton into the air, it flew higher, further, faster than any baton has ever flown before, hitting a transformer and showering the darkened arena with sparks.
Look.
And when it finally did come down, Marjorie, my sister caught that baton, and 12,000 people jumped to their feet for 16½ minutes of uninterrupted thunderous ovation as flames illuminated her tear-stained face. And that, Marjorie, just so you will know, and your children will someday know, is the night the lights went out in Georgia.
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Well, now you do.
I'll show you one more clip of Julia. Julia, me growing up as a teenager, was my hero.
Excuse me, but you lovely ladies look like you're in need of a little male companionship here.
Trust me when I tell you that you have completely misassessed the situation at this table.
Sense of humor. I like that. You're,
Charlene Fraser.
no kidding. I have a sister named Arlene.
Oh, really? I have sisters named Marlene, Darlene, and Harlene.
I have a brother named Skip.
Allow me to introduce myself. Ray Don Simpson.
Well, there's no need for introductions, Ray Don. We know who you are.
You do?
Of course. You're the guy who's always wherever women gather or try to be alone. You want to eat with us when we're dining in hotels. You want to know if the book we're reading is any good or if you can keep us company on the plane. And I want to thank you, Ray Don, on behalf of all the women in the world for your unfailing attention and concern. But read my lips and remember, as hard as it is to believe, sometimes we like talking just to each other, and sometimes we like just being alone.
Okay, I can take a hint. You got a little girl talk. So I'll just go make a couple of phone calls and be right back.
Julia, he just asked to sit down. You didn't have to annihilate him. Oh, I'm sorry, but you just cannot be nice to a man like that.
Oh, well, hello, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I don't know where the time went to. Ted and I were at a bookstore getting that new Michelin guide on Paris.
Oh, that's all right. Here, have a hors d'oeuvre.
You and Ted are going to Paris? Oh, just for the week.
So I wanted to show in this presentation, because I was presenting to the good people of Georgia, my adopted state, I wanted to show the indomitable spirit of Georgian women. And that is still something that continues to this day. And especially with what's going on in the world today, with all of these issues of sexual misconduct, women, and not just women, but people everywhere need to stand up for ourselves and for our rights. And fortunately and unfortunately, that's going on. I do want to let you know that in this country, women still do not have equal rights in this country. The ERA amendment was back in 1980. It was almost ratified and lost out by 1 vote. Now it is up to us and the new generation to speak up for ourselves and gain the rights that we deserve, not only as women, but as human beings. Thank you.